Hi, welcome to the channel. Today's video is titled The Entire History of Scotland. All right, we are excited to check this video together. And yeah, I love your thoughts and your contribution in the comments below. Let's dive right in.
The proud nation of Scotland, home to highlands, islands, lowlands and lochs. Despite being part of the modern United Kingdom, of which it is the second largest in terms of land and population size, Scotland was, up until the early 18th century, a fully separate and independent nation. This was the direct result of centuries of struggle, warfare and adaptation, shaped by alliances, betrayals, and perhaps most importantly, the enduring spirit of its people, who were determined to shape their own destiny for themselves. But how did this nation coalesce from a group of Celtic tribes into becoming one of the most patriotic and culturally recognizable countries on the planet today? This is the history of Scotland.
Okay.
Just to let you know that some of the
I think this is an ad, so yeah, we're going to skip that. Uh, okay. Okay, wait, what? Let's go back a bit. Nope, 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 nope. History of Scotland? Yeah.
or additions to your personal collection. Follow the link in the video description below.
Okay, still part of the ad. Okay, yeah, yeah. Up, 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 up. Ooh, oh, go forward now.
The land that would one day become the nation of Scotland has been inhabited by humans for well over 10,000 years.
10,000?
Although little is known about these early people, as they left no written records, they lived much like their counterparts across Europe at the time, first as nomadic hunter-gatherers, before gradually settling down into permanent communities with the advent of farming around 6,000 years ago. Some of these early settlements saw the construction of megalithic standing stone circles, such as those at Stenness in Orkney and Callanish on the Isle of Lewis, which served as sites of religious and ritual practice. The first written account of Scotland did not come from its native inhabitants, but from Pytheas of Massalia, a Greek geographer who, around 325 BC, possibly circumnavigated around the entirety of Britain. He named the whole island Albion, but referred to the northernmost part as Orcus, a name
Albion. Orcas. Wow. Quite interesting.
that later influenced the designation of the Orkney,
Back a bit? Yeah.
but referred to the northernmost part as Orcus, a name that later influenced the designation of the Orkney Islands. In the following centuries, this geographical knowledge of the British Isles passed into the hands of the Romans, who launched their invasion of Britain from across the Channel in 43 AD. Although they initially conquered the southern portion of the island, they gradually pushed northwards in the subsequent decades, and by 71 AD had entered what is now southern Scotland. The Romans probed further into Scotland during the 80s AD, as part of an effort by the new governor of Britannia, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, to bring the entire island under Roman rule. Many of the native tribes had already submitted to Roman authority by this point, but the Caledonians, led by their chieftain Calgacus, continued to offer resistance. Determined to subdue the last unconquered tribe of Britannia, Agricola led his legions into northeastern Scotland and decisively defeated the Caledonians at the Battle of Mons Graupius in 80.
Caledonians. Is it the same Caledonia that we have today? I think there's a part where there is New Caledonia, not Caledonia or something. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with the exact name, but I know there's a Caledonia. Is it the same people or this is a different people? Somebody let me know in the comments below.
Last unconquered tribe of Britannia, Agricola led his legions into northeastern Scotland and decisively defeated the Caledonians at the Battle of Mons Graupius in 84 AD. In the battle's aftermath, the Romans constructed a series of forts and watchtowers in an attempt to consolidate their hold over the region. However, within just a few years, many of these fortifications were abandoned as the Romans withdrew their forces further south. This was likely due to a combination of factors, including the economic and military costs of administering a rugged and relatively undeveloped land, which was inhabited by a warlike people who continued to resist Roman rule. By 87 AD, the Roman occupation was largely limited to the southern uplands, and by the end of the 1st century, their northernmost boundary had been drawn on a line between the River Tyne and the Solway Firth. This frontier was later marked by the construction of Hadrian's Wall, which began in 122 AD.
Did I hear Adrian's War?
Despite withdrawing from Scotland, the Romans remained determined not to concede defeat and continued launching military expeditions beyond the wall. Around 141 AD, they briefly reoccupied southern Scotland, constructing a new line of fortifications between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde, known as the Antonine Wall. However, this too was abandoned shortly after 160 AD, and the Romans retreated once again. Although further campaigns were conducted in Scotland over the following centuries, Rome's northernmost frontier remained fixed at Hadrian's Wall for the remainder of the empire's existence in Britannia. The intermittent Roman presence in Scotland coincided with the emergence of the Picts, a confederation of Celtic tribes living north of the Forth and Clyde, who may have been the descendants of the Caledonians. By the late 4th century, however, Rome's grip on northern Britannia was weakening, and several barbarian groups began launching incursions into Roman-held territory. The Picts attacked Hadrian's Wall from the north, the Germanic Saxons raided westwards from across the North Sea, and similarly, seafarers from Ireland carried out raids along the
Picts. Where are these Picts from? Wait, let me take it back. Picts.
However, Rome's grip on northern Britannia was weakening, and several barbarian groups began launching incursions into Roman-held territory. The Picts attacked Hadrian's Wall from the north, the Germanic Saxons raided westwards from across the North Sea, and similarly, seafarers from Ireland carried out raids along the western coast. It was this latter group, known as the Scotti, who would leave the longest lasting impression on the region and give rise to the nation that would ultimately bear their name.
Wait, the Scotti? They're from Ireland? Hmm? Hmm? Abi, what is going on? Okay.
Scotia, or Scotland.
Okay.
Sea, and similarly, seafarers from Ireland carried out raids along the western coast. It was this latter group, known as the Scotti, who would leave the longest lasting impression on the region and give rise to the nation that would ultimately bear their name, Scotia, or Scotland. Following the Romans' withdrawal from Britain in 410 AD, these differing barbarian tribes carved out their own respective and distinct kingdoms across the region. The Picts, who spoke a variety of the old Celtic language, formed the kingdom of Fortriu in the northeast. The Anglo-Saxons, who spoke a form of Old English, established the kingdom of Bernicia, which would later become the kingdom of Northumbria in the southeast.
Oh.
The Brythonic Celtic-speaking peoples of the kingdom of Strathclyde settled in the southwest, while the Gaelic-speaking Scotti formed the kingdom of Dal Riata in the west, which all
4. So all together is gonna be okay.
peoples of the kingdom of Strathclyde settled in the southwest, while the Gaelic-speaking Scotti formed the kingdom of Dal Riata in the west, which also extended into parts of what is now Northern Ireland. During this period, the British Isles were undergoing a profound religious transformation. In 563 AD, the Irish monk Saint Columba led a mission across the sea, establishing the monastery of Iona on a remote island off the western coast of Scotland. This monastic community became the spiritual heart of a movement that, over the next century, saw the gradual conversion of the Gaels, Picts, and Saxons from their ancestral pagan beliefs to Christianity. Although these kingdoms shared a common faith, they retained their political differences which resulted in centuries of almost incessant warfare as one kingdom temporarily gained ascendancy over the others. This fragile balance of power, however, was disrupted in 793 AD when a new group of raiders arrived on Scotland's shores. The Viking Age began with ferocious raids on the isolated Christian monasteries, notably those at Iona and Lindisfarne. These initial attacks increased in number and intensity over the following years, before giving way to permanent Norse colonies being established in Orkney, Shetland, and the Western Isles by the early 9th century, with the latter forming the mixed Norse-Gaelic kingdom of the Isles by 849 AD.
Northwards? Okay, this is King of Isles.
The Viking incursions prompted the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriata to merge with the Pictish kingdom of Fortriu in the 840s, under the leadership of Kenneth MacAlpin. Over time, MacAlpin's successors established the Kingdom of Alba in the early 10th century, laying the foundations for the emergence of the Kingdom of Scotland. By the end of the 11th century, this kingdom had absorbed the territory of Strathclyde, as well as parts of Northumbria, forming a border with the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the south, which had by this point united to form the Kingdom of England. The 11th century was a pivotal era in Scotland's history, witnessing the rise of the Dunkeld dynasty, which would come to rule the kingdom for the following 200 years. However, it was also during this time that an increasing degree of foreign influence began to be felt in Scotland's politics. After consolidating his control over England in 1066, William the Conqueror marched north to force King Malcolm III to submit to his authority. Some Norman knights entered the service of the Scottish royal court and introduced a new influence, which resulted in the adoption of Norman feudal practices, which thereafter irreversibly linked Scotland with the power dynamics of its southern neighbour. Scotland was, however, not solely being influenced by England during this time. The Western Isles remained under the control of the descendants of the early Norse colonisers and were officially recognised as part of the Kingdom of Norway in the year 1098.
Wow.
By the 13th century, Scotland had begun pressuring Norway to relinquish its hold on these territories. Although it would take fighting an inconclusive battle at Largs in 1263 before King Alexander III successfully negotiated the annexation of the islands, as well as the Isle of Man, through signing the Treaty of Perth in 1266. Despite this territorial consolidation, Alexander III's untimely death 20 years later in 1286 plunged Scotland into a succession crisis. The clan system, which had emerged during the 12th century, contributed to the instability, as no fewer than 14 claimants vied for the throne.
I also want to know the history about their culture with the men, the outfit, or whatever. I hope it's gonna be here. I hope it's gonna be here because I love it too.
The Scottish nobles, therefore, sought the mediation of King Edward I of England to settle the dispute. However, he used the opportunity to extract legal recognition of Scotland being a feudal dependency of the English crown, before choosing John Balliol as its new king in 1292. Edward further exploited the concessions he had gained to undermine Scotland's monarchy and independence in the following years. In response, Scotland entered into an alliance with France, hoping that it would offer protection from any further English aggression. These hopes were nevertheless soon dashed. In 1296, Edward I invaded Scotland to take the kingdom for himself. One of the most symbolic acts of his conquest was the removal of the Stone of Scone, the sacred coronation stone of Scottish monarchs, to Westminster Abbey in London. There, Edward had it incorporated into his coronation chair, as a declaration of his authority as Lord Paramount of Scotland. The stone was subsequently used in the coronation of all English and later British monarchs. In response to the English occupation, a group of Scottish nobles, led by William Wallace, raised an army and began the series of conflicts known to history as the Wars of Scottish Independence. Wallace won a notable victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, but was defeated by King Edward I in the following year at the Battle of Falkirk. Forced into hiding, Wallace was eventually captured in 1305, taken to London, and summarily executed as a traitor, despite never having sworn loyalty to Edward. Following Wallace's death, Robert the Bruce was crowned as the King of Scotland in 1306 and continued the struggle against English rule. His decisive victory at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 secured Scotland's de facto independence and helped bring an end to the first phase of the conflict by 13.
Independence? Wait, what?
Bruce was crowned as the King of Scotland in 1306 and continued the struggle against English rule. His decisive victory at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 secured Scotland's de facto independence and helped bring an end to the first phase of the conflict by 1328. However, war erupted again in 1332 as part of yet another succession crisis for the Scottish crown. The conflict only concluded in 1357 with the Treaty of Berwick.
Let me ask this. What does de facto independence mean? I would love to know.
Following the release of King David II, part of yet another succession crisis for the Scottish crown. The conflict only concluded in 1357 with the Treaty of Berwick, following the release of King David II, Robert the Bruce's son, from captivity in London after he had been captured at the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346. With its independence firmly established, Scotland, under David II's successor, Robert II, entered into a new era in 1371 with the establishment of the Stuart dynasty, a royal lineage that would dominate Scottish and later British history for the next 300 years.
300?
The dawning of the 15th century saw Scotland emerge geographically as the nation we recognise today. Although it lost control of the Isle of Man in the early 1400s, in 1468 it acquired its last significant territorial expansion when King James III received the Orkney and Shetland Islands as part of his marriage to Margaret of Denmark. The city of Edinburgh too gained significance, as it formally became the nation's capital in 1437, replacing the historic role that Scone had played as the site of the coronations. Many of Scotland's major educational institutions were also founded during this time, including the University of St Andrews in 1413, the University of Glasgow in 1451, and the University of Aberdeen in 1495.
Wow, so much history
By
there.
the early 16th century, however, Scotland once again found itself embroiled in a war with England. In 1513, King James IV invaded his southern neighbour, only to suffer a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Flodden Field. The Scottish army was decimated, and James IV himself was killed, becoming the last British monarch to die in battle. His son and successor, James V, fared little better, suffering a crushing defeat at the Battle of Solway Moss in 1542. These conflicts were closely tied to the religious upheavals sweeping across Europe at the time.
I would also love that they share the history behind their traditional attire, traditional outfits. Also, that's the right word, right? I would also love to know about that, how they come about, like what they have today as their tradition with the outfit. It's just beautiful when you look at it, right? Or when you see it, or when they're all dressed in the tradition or the traditional attire or whatever. It's just beautiful. I would also love some history behind it because it's gonna be beautiful. I love that. I love history. Right?
As part of the Protestant Reformation. In 1534, King Henry VIII of England broke with the Catholic Church to establish his own Church of England. Determined to weaken the historic Old Alliance between Catholic Scotland and Catholic France, Henry launched a brutal campaign known as the Rough Wooing, in an attempt to bring Scotland onto his side and force a marriage between his son, Prince Edward, and the young Scottish Queen Mary. Although the war ended in 1551,
How old were they? How old were they? Because they look so young. How old were they? But that's by the way. I just want to say that lots of the time, things that happens in history, when you get to hear some things, they are just so brutal. Brutal.
Queen Mary was sent to France.
Queen Mary was sent to France, okay.
His son, Prince Edward, and the young Scottish Queen Mary. Although the war ended in 1551, Queen Mary was sent to France, where she married the heir to the French throne, Francis II, in 1558. Their union was short-lived, as Francis died in 1560, and Mary returned to Scotland, only to find her homeland had severed ties with France and formally embraced Protestantism. Mary's reign as queen was plagued by political turmoil. Though she remained a Catholic, she did not attempt to overturn the Protestant Reformation, an approach that satisfied neither her Catholic supporters nor her Protestant rivals. Amid conspiracies and rebellions, she was ultimately forced to abdicate in 1567 in favour of her infant son, James VI. A civil war quickly followed, with factions loyal to the young king battling those who still supported his mother. When later seeking refuge in England, Mary found herself imprisoned by her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, who eventually had her executed for treason. Despite his mother's fate, James VI of Scotland inherited the English throne upon Elizabeth's death in 1603, thereby becoming the king of both nations through the union of the crowns.
To unify.
While this was a dynastic and personal union, Scotland and England remained as two separate kingdoms, each with its own government and legal system. However,
You see this again, the level of brutality that happened in the past is just wild. It's just so wild.
remained as two separate kingdoms, each with its own government and legal system. However, James moved his royal court to London, and from that point forward, Scotland's monarchy would be based in the English capital. The political distance between Scotland and its monarchy also widened in the subsequent years under James's son, Charles I, who ascended the throne in 1625. His attempt to impose an English-style prayer book in Scotland in 1637 provoked widespread unrest, particularly among the Presbyterian Scottish Covenanters. When Charles sought to suppress this opposition, he inadvertently sparked a broader conflict that would engulf Scotland, England, and Ireland for the next 14 years, the War of the Three Kingdoms. Initially, the Covenanters allied with the English parliamentarians against Charles and his royalist supporters. However, not all in Scotland supported the rebellion, with many Highland clans remaining loyal to the king and putting up an armed resistance. Following Charles I's execution in 1649, Scotland immediately proclaimed his son, Charles II, who was in exile, as its rightful monarch. Although this defiance led to an English invasion by Oliver Cromwell's forces in 1650, culminating in a decisive Scottish defeat at the Battle of Dunbar that same year. In 1652, Scotland was incorporated into the Commonwealth alongside England and Ireland under Oliver Cromwell's leadership. However, following Cromwell's death and the collapse of his regime, Charles II was restored as King of both Scotland and England in 1660. Upon his death in 1685, the crowns passed to his brother, James, a Roman Catholic, who became James VII of Scotland and James II of England. His reign reignited religious tensions across both kingdoms, as he appointed Catholics to key government positions, and, following the birth of his son in 1688, fears that a Catholic dynasty would be reimposed over a largely Protestant populace began to take hold. In response, a group of English politicians invited William of Orange, James's Protestant son-in-law and nephew, to intervene. William landed with his Dutch army on England's south coast, forcing James to flee into exile in France. William and his wife Mary, who was James's Protestant daughter, assumed joint rule over both England and Scotland. While support for the pair was widespread, a significant portion of Scotland, again particularly in the Highlands, remained loyal to James's cause. His claim to the throne, along with that of his descendants, became known as Jacobitism and sparked a series of uprisings that would ignite over the coming decades. The first Jacobite rising broke out in 1689, and despite initial success, the rebel forces were ultimately defeated by government troops at the Battle of Dunkeld. Any remaining threats of rebellion were ruthlessly suppressed, most infamously in the massacre of Glencoe in 1692, where 38 members of Clan MacDonald were killed for allegedly failing to swear allegiance to the new monarchs in
38. So this is a do or die affair. You must.
time. By the late 17th century, Scotland faced severe,
Go back first.
most infamously in the massacre of Glencoe in 1692, where 38 members of Clan MacDonald were killed for allegedly failing to swear allegiance to the new monarchs in time. By the late 17th century, Scotland faced severe financial hardship, prompting calls to diversify its economy. Seeking to replicate the success of England's mercantile overseas colonies, the banker and trader William Paterson devised an ambitious plan to establish a Scottish colony on the Isthmus of Panama. The Darien scheme, as it became known, attracted massive financial backing from across all sections of Scottish society, absorbing nearly 1/5 of the nation's wealth at that time. However, the venture proved disastrous, with the inhospitable conditions of the Panamanian jungle claiming the lives of most settlers, forcing the surviving colonists to abandon the scheme entirely and return to Scotland by 1700. The collapse of the Darien scheme plunged the country into further economic crisis at the turn of the 18th century, leading many to consider closer political and economic ties with England. Consequently, in 1707, the Scottish Parliament ratified the Treaty of Union, merging the kingdoms of Scotland and England into a single political entity.
Oh, this is the flag. Or this. Wow. It's not any different from what we see today now, right? It's not any different.
The Kingdom of Great Britain, under its first ruler.
Wait, the Kingdom of Great Britain. Ah, I'm supposed to take, yeah.
Consequently, in 1707, the Scottish Parliament ratified the Treaty of Union, merging the kingdoms of Scotland and England into a single political entity, the Kingdom of Great Britain,
Kingdom of
under
Great
its
Britain.
first ruler, Queen Anne. Despite the promises of economic stability, the union was met with widespread opposition in Scotland, with many viewing it as a betrayal of the hard-won sovereignty from centuries past. This discontent fueled renewed Jacobite support, particularly for James Francis Edward Stuart, known as the Old Pretender, who launched an uprising in 1715 in an attempt to reclaim the throne from the newly crowned Hanoverian King George I. However, the rebellion failed after the Jacobite forces were defeated at the Battle of Sheriffmuir, forcing James to retreat into exile in France once more. Further Jacobite uprisings followed in 1719 and 1745, with the latter being the most significant. Led by James's son, Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, the Jacobite forces initially made remarkable gains, even capturing Edinburgh. However, their campaign ultimately ended in disaster at the Battle of Culloden in 1746, which not only ended the Jacobite cause once and for all, but also marked the last pitched battle ever to be fought on British soil. In the aftermath of the failed risings, the British government imposed strict measures to dismantle the Highland clan system, which had been a crucial support base for the Jacobite cause. Clan chiefs were stripped of their traditional authority and reduced to commercial landowners, leading to widespread evictions of tenant farmers and the formation of crofting communities. Despite these upheavals, the latter half of the 18th century saw Scotland emerge as a hub of intellectual, economic, and scientific progress. The Scottish Enlightenment gave rise to some of the nation's most influential figures, including the poet Robert Burns and the economist Adam Smith, whose work, The Wealth of Nations, laid the foundations for modern economic theory. By the dawn of the 19th century, Scotland had undergone rapid industrialisation, accompanied by the rise of a thriving financial sector that would shape its future economic prosperity.
Wow. All of this information is just mind blowing. I'm just looking at it like, wow. Wow.
Scotland's transformation into a leading industrial power came suddenly and unexpectedly. The population grew from 1.6 million in 1801 to over 4.4 million by the end of the century.
Wow.
Many sought work in the rapidly expanding urban centres, such as Edinburgh and Glasgow, as well as in the industrial belt stretching from the southwest to the northeast of the country. While industrialisation brought employment and economic growth, it also introduced significant social challenges. Overcrowded and unsanitary living conditions in the cities led to widespread disease and high mortality rates. As a result, many Scots sought new opportunities abroad, with approximately 2 million emigrating to North America and Australia over the course of the 19th century. By the early 20th century, Scotland had become an integral part of the United Kingdom and one of the most industrialised regions of the British Empire. The River Clyde was a global hub for shipbuilding, while coal mining, steel production, and heavy engineering flourished across the Central Belt. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 saw Scotland contribute a disproportionately high number of soldiers relative to its population, with Scottish regiments suffering heavy losses on many of the battlefields in Flanders. The interwar years proved particularly difficult for the nation, as the decline of heavy industry led to soaring unemployment, with Glasgow witnessing a violent strike in 1919. Though the Second World War briefly revived Scotland's industrial output, by the late 1940s it was evident that the country's traditional industries, like those across Britain, were in irreversible decline. Scotland continued to experience economic and social decline in the latter half of the 20th century, leading to growing calls for greater autonomy from British government in Westminster. This culminated in 1999 with the official reconvening of the Scottish Parliament after nearly 300 years. Under a devolution agreement, it was granted authority over key areas such as health, education, and judicial matters. Since then, Scotland has continued to question its role and relationship within the broader political structure of the United Kingdom, perhaps having reflected upon its own history, where external influence has often been seen as contrary to the nation's best interests. This ongoing, passionate debate has raised the question as to whether Scotland should become an independent nation once more.
Wow, interesting. But do you think Scotland should become an independent nation, or should just stay together, or be united with Great Britain? I just think they should stay that way, stay united, right? But in everything that was gathered here, this was so detailed with interesting information from this. I love what we gathered here so far. It's mind blowing. I was just looking at it. I'm like, wow. Lots of information just to digest, to soak it all in. Because I actually haven't thought of checking the history of Scotland, right? But now this like curiosity just kind of made me want to check it. And this is mind blowing. It is mind blowing indeed. But I still want to know about their traditional outfits, the history behind it, because I want to know. I want to know. Maybe I'm going to sort out for videos that might have also share or talk about it. But again, this was interesting, detailed information shared here. If you're Scottish and maybe there are some information that were not shared here, you can also share them in the comments so we can learn from each other as well. But make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and all that stuff. And until next time, see you in the next video.